I'm Leanne, the founder of Braver Women. I specialise in behavioural change for LGBTQ+ women who have spent years abandoning themselves in order to belong. Most women who come to my work aren't lacking insight. They already understand themselves really well, but what hasn't changed is how they respond under pressure. Over the past few years of helping clients from all over the world, I've noticed that this work consistently comes down to a small number of recurring problems, patterns that show up again and again, even in very capable women. When these aren't addressed in the right order, they simply stay stuck. The first thing that usually matters is recognizing the actual pattern before treating it like a personal failure or a personality trait. On the surface, what looks like anxiety, self-sabotage, or emotional weakness is often a predictable system. Silence or shutting down can feel safer than speaking honestly about what you feel, what you think, or even what you need. Because at some point, honesty had consequences. Holding everything in too, and presenting a capable version of yourself to the outside world becomes the way that somebody learns to stay intact. Now, over time, all of this coping becomes a coping system that grows on the inside. Negative self-talk, for example, becomes a way of punishing yourself in an attempt to try harder, but it only ends up reinforcing a sense of worthlessness, pushing people away, creating conflict, or testing partners to avoid abandonment, as well as using substances to manage stress, all become, they too are ways of coping within the system. Now, that strategy can work for years, but it tends to break down in adult relationships. When the pattern isn't recognized, women blame themselves instead of changing how they respond. Many of the women I work with have spent years adapting themselves to stay connected to the people around them. Now, that adaptation can look like strength on the outside, but internally it can mean learning time and time again to abandon your own needs to keep relationships intact, romantic or otherwise. And when that happens for long enough, self-abandonment becomes the default way of coping to avoid intense emotions such as fear or rejection. Now, this work is about reversing that pattern, so connection no longer requires leaving yourself behind. Another issue that shows up consistently is that understanding yourself really well doesn't translate into change. Understanding your history doesn't stop nervous system shutdown in the moments that really matter. Now, insight explains behavior, but it doesn't reorganize it under pressure. This is why so many women can spend years understanding themselves and still repeat the same moments of collapse. Without a different structure for change, these patterns rarely shift on their own. Instead, they tend to repeat, leaving many women feeling increasingly frustrated, confused, and unsure why the same experiences keep happening in their lives. The issue isn't effort. Understanding sits outside the moments where capacity is actually tested. Now, what usually follows is a misunderstanding. That's the next part. A misunderstanding about how emotional capacity is actually built. Nervous systems don't change when things are calm. They change when somebody learns how to stay present before crisis. Emotional capacity isn't a mindset or a personality trait of strength. It's a trained response. It's a skill set. It has to be built in the moments where someone would normally shut down or disconnect from themselves, not in the moments where they already cope. Where this becomes most visible, though, is in relationships and relational dynamics. Many women I work with function well at work and struggle in their personal lives. Now, work provides structure and clear expectations, doesn't it? But relationships, they expose needs, they expose vulnerability and emotional history, as well as attachment. Now, without internal structure, emotional capacity, and a strong sense of self, intimacy destabilizes people. This is why being honest often fails in relationships while competence holds everywhere else in your life. The final issue is how change is attempted. Talking and processing can be helpful, but without behavioral correction, people can often stay stuck in the same loop. Real change requires structure, repetition, consistency, and feedback so that steadiness becomes internal over time. Change also requires regular human attunement so that you can develop your own handrail to hold on to rather than outsourcing your power, especially when things become tough. Now, the route out of fearing abandonment is learning not to abandon yourself. And that's done by having a self to return to. That is the work I focus on in Braver Women. Rebuilding the internal capacity lesbian and queer women need after years of abandoning themselves to belong, so that they can finally feel secure in who they are, trust themselves, and hold their ground in their lives and relationships without feeling that they have to lose themselves just to fit in or be loved.